Hello, I'm Jennifer Zabasaja. Welcome to Africa's Climate Agenda, presented by Project Syndicate. So in many ways, Africa is on the front line of the global climate emergency. Simultaneously, the most vulnerable continent on Earth to rising temperatures, and also the poorest. So how can the continent achieve a similar level of development to the parts of the world whose emissions cause the dire environmental devastation which currently plagues part of the continent? Is green industrialization a reality? And can Africa actually become its pioneer? To help us answer those questions today, we have Joyce Banda. She is the former president of the Republic of Malawi, along with a panel made up of some of Africa's top experts on climate and development. We'll be hearing from them in just a minute. But the most important part of the mix is, of course, you, the audience watching. We'd love for you to be a part of the conversation, too, particularly if you are from Africa. So please do get involved using the hashtag Africa's Climate Agenda. So in a few moments, as I mentioned, we'll be coming to our panel. But first, let's take a look at some of the issues that we'll be talking about.
A state of emergency has been declared in Malawi after a tropical storm, Freddie, struck the country for a second time, killing more than 100 people. The cyclone is one of the longest running in history and has caused havoc across parts of southern Africa.
All right, so those were just a few of the questions we'll be unpacking for the next half hour with our panel, who I am delighted to now be able to introduce. First off, we have Yuba Sakona, who was until very recently a vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He has over 40 years of experience addressing energy, environment, and sustainable development issues in Africa. We also have Mohamed Ado. He is the founder and director of Power Shift Africa, which recently published a comprehensive report on Africa's transition to a green economy and wants to shift climate and energy policies to zero carbon. We also have Carlos Lopez, who is the chair of the African Climate Foundation Board, which gives grants to schemes that focus on green development opportunities and is the first African-led foundation to do so. He's also a professor of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. And finally, we have Wangari Muchiri. She is the director of Africa Wind Power at the Global Wind Energy Council. She's also a renewable energy engineer and an expert in energy planning. Welcome to you all. I couldn't think of a better panel to help us discuss this topic today. And I just want to have one more quick reminder for the audience watching. We really want you to be a part of this too. So please let us know what you have to say, if you have any thoughts, by hopping on the hashtag Africa's Climate Agenda. So thank you all. So let's get into this because we don't have that much time. Mohamed, I really want to start with you because today our event is called Africa's Climate Agenda. Let's start here. Is it a fundamental problem that currently the continent, which we're talking about 54 countries, doesn't really have one? And is that even possible in your mind, Mohamed?
Yes, I think the reality of climate change is that Africa, which didn't cause the climate crisis, is now suffering from and worse the impact of climate change. And so there is an opportunity for Africa that didn't cause the climate crisis to actually lead the world in fixing it. How Africa develops over the next 2 decades will actually determine the fate of the planet. So the opportunity we now have is whether we can actually support Africa to develop a climate policy so that it can actually be able to unlock the kind of investment and funding that is required to help this continent be able to leapfrog, dirty energy and become a green leader. So the opportunity we have now is to discuss how we can boost investment in Africa so that we can help communities in this continent who are on the front line of climate change to be able to adjust effectively and to be able to adapt. And more importantly, be able to leapfrog and become a green leader. So the opportunity we have now is to support Africa to take the high road of development.
And Wangari, I see you nodding there. Can you jump in? I mean, and I mentioned this, there's 54 countries with a lot of different climate conditions. I mean, how is it possible to have a unified climate agenda considering?
Absolutely. I think you're right. We are 54 countries across the continent who have different development targets, are at different levels within their own development. But one thing we share across the continent is that we all have amazing capacity for renewable energy. And I think one of the things that we need to really look closely is how can this abundant resource that we have on the continent, not only in terms of resource, sun and wind, but also in terms of critical minerals, which really go into manufacturing these green technologies. How can that really contribute to our sustainable development? And I think when we come together as Africans and have that discussion, we see that there's really a lot that we can contribute out into the world in regard to a transition, in regard to bringing more sustainability and tackling climate change.
And Yuba, jump in here following these two comments. I mean, we talk about the Industrial Revolution and we talk about how emissions and wealth sort of have this link together. But now we're talking about green industrialization for this continent, right? And how does that exist in your mind, Yuba? I mean, what is the path that Africa can actually follow, especially considering sort of what, Wangari was just saying? There's a lot of other developmental challenges that the continent is currently facing. Yuba, what would you say?
I think that there is a precondition of that. Unless you have your proper energy system in place, there is no way you can address any kind of industrialization. I think that the critical issue, the critical problem is that to start with what the African head of the states and the African Union Commission indicated as where Africa would be in 50 years. This is Agenda 2063. That should be the basis of any form of Africa climate agenda or any African narrative. Is from that, if you address properly your energy issue, you can bring in the industrialization. If you look at current energy system in the continent, the situation, the industrialization of the continent is the forklift. And those are the fundamental issues we need to address first.
So then what would you prioritize then? I mean, if there was one thing that you think would really actually start to make a dent in the African continent's development towards this green transition, Yuba, what would you say that leaders need to be focusing on?
I think that, as I indicated, energy at the beginning of everything. If you look at anything in the world, unless you address the energy issue, you will not be able to go anywhere. It's not an end by itself, but it's a means of achieving any form, any kind of well-being of the people. You address first. And then we have the opportunity that we are not locking any energy system. The issue in the continent is not the transition. One fundamental transition is needed on the energy sector, which is to move away from cooking with charcoal and firewood. A part that the other is you need to build a system. And then we have the opportunity actually to have a wide range of options and the possibilities. Those we are not taking them. And those are where we need to start. And then we need to start to bring together the three fundamental clusters to navigate between all of them. We are not doing that in the continent. That's the policy cluster, the knowledge cluster, and the practice cluster. All of them are disconnected in the continent. And then we need to bring all of it together from the continent, the perspective of the continent.
And just on the back of that, Carlos, I want to bring you in, and in particular, I want us to take a look at this graph because it shows the three countries in Africa with the highest dependence on oil as a percentage of GDP. We just heard Yuba there talking about it's a focus on shifting away. As you can see here in Libya, it's over half. I mean, how do you begin to approach the greening of an economy that has so many deep problems, a reliance on oil revenue? There's a number of mounting crises that they're dealing with. Carlos, where would you start? What is your perspective on this?
Well, it's not a coincidence that these three countries are facing huge political problems. And I think a lot of these problems are based on the economic model that we have followed since colonial times, which is the commodity dependency model, where the interpretation of the theory of comparative advantages is basically for the service of other economies, not necessarily the countries that possess the richness in natural resources. So turning natural resources into single forms of revenue as signified, as Yuba was explaining, that we didn't go through the industrialization route, that we have not produced the requirements for structural transformation of the economies. And as a result, we are now facing a situation where Africa is the only country where value addition is not at the levels that you can find elsewhere. And of course, the oil dependency is just one aspect of it. And if we are going to actually take advantage of the opportunities offered by the ecological transition, and in particular the energy transition, we have to base all the transition in Africa with the use of our minerals that are strategic, with the potential that exists for different technologies to arrest emissions in a way that is going to produce structural transformation, that is going to propel Africa to have a different economic model.
So then should the focus not be necessarily, Mohammed, I see you nodding there, should the focus then not be necessarily turning off the dependency on oil?
There are two things, and I think let's first think through the Pan-African industrial approach. That is right. The first thing we need to do is actually break out of the post-colonial trap of prioritizing extractive industry and assembly line manufacturing, and Africa continuing to export low value added, exports to foreign countries. I think what we need is to develop internal African markets and economies of scale so that we can be able to formulate the kind of strategic partnerships and trade relations on Pan-African level. I think if we're going to transition, What we need to do is be able to actually develop the green industrial base in Africa. Take the example of the strategic minerals that the world is looking forward to actually use to decarbonize. 40% of those strategic minerals are found in Africa.
Right.
And this is a continent that has a limited energy capacity. So what we need to do is break free from subcontracting to the global north and exporting our low value added raw materials and build productive systems that generate opportunities for Africans, that increases employment and secures a greater share of the benefits for Africa. There's no point for Nigeria, for example, to export its oil, crude oil, and then import refined petroleum products. That hasn't helped Nigeria economy, and neither will the export of our strategic minerals help the Democratic Republic of Congo or Namibia. What we're calling for is a pan-African industrial approach where Africans can actually pull together and be able to break out of the colonial trap that has been set for us.
Yeah, and we've been hearing a lot of that from a number of African leaders, especially more recently. I mean, Wangari, I see you nodding here. Are you seeing are you optimistic about the direction that we're currently headed in? Or do you think there needs to be a more strategic shift into what Mohammed was just alluding to?
I definitely am optimistic about where we could go in terms of really taking advantage of the minerals that we have, and even some of the potential that we have in regard to what Mohammed referred to. It's right. None of the fossil fuel extraction has really benefited Africa to the extent that it should. And we have a lot of opportunity. If you look at all the other critical minerals that are coming into play now for the transition, copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, some of the minerals, the biggest reserves are on the continent. So how do we ensure that we do value addition locally, one for our own market, but then also we'll be able to export as the rest of the world is still deconstructing fossil fuel heavy energy systems. In addition to that, as we build our own energy systems, we still have 600 million people who do not have access to electricity. As we build that, we need to ensure that we are building the skills, the capacity, we're transferring the knowledge, we're bringing local manufacturing into Africa to ensure that we really meet that need for renewable energy and for more sustainable value chains. One of the things that I am seeing is also jobs will come with these different transformations. I think it's important not to look at this as just a technical transformation, but some of the, and I think my fellow panelists referred to the Africa Agenda 2063. If you look at trying to create incomes and jobs and decent work, renewable energy does that. In fact, we create 2.7 times more jobs than the fossil fuel industry. Why are we not trying to really multiply those jobs? If we look at trying to feed our population, we now know that we're suffering droughts in many areas in Africa. How can we use climate smart agriculture to ensure that our yield from our arable land, of which we have the most of in the world, is really enabling us to feed our populations with sustainable food? So I think there's a lot of opportunity that we can tap into here that we're not yet really looking at, but I think there is an opportunity and I am optimistic about it.
Do carbon credits get factored in here? I want to ask the group here, because there's a lot of talk about carbon credits. There's still very much in development. Does that sort of distract the continent itself, or is this something that we should be tapping into? Mohammed, you want to jump in?
Yes, absolutely. So the first thing perhaps for me to say is carbon markets are a distraction. In fact, they're actually a wall in ship plotting. What we need to be thinking about is how we can actually help this continent attract climate funding from those polluting countries and companies in the global north who've caused climate change in the first place that is now devastating Africa's people. We have seen a lot of people, especially at the head of the Africa Climate Summit, who are pushing for the carbon market and specifically the Africa Carbon Market Initiative. And I want to say, particularly to the African leaders coming to Nairobi next week, we must reject the Africa Carbon Market Initiative. It's a dangerous distraction from the real interest and priorities for Africa's development, for Africa's climate, energy, biodiversity, and resilience. I think let's not confuse two things. There is no point Africa of providing the very countries that have caused climate change polluting permits in the name of carbon credits. We are already facing unimaginable disaster with only 1.1 degree of warming. So if we're going to actually allow the Western companies to continue to emit huge quantities of greenhouse gases in the coming decades, and then purchasing polluting permits to offset those emissions, we're not going to be able to actually put the world on a safe pathway. I think there's no room for illusion of offsets in a world that has vastly exceeded the safe levels of climate pollution.
Yeah.
And companies need to now be asked to aim for zero emissions as fast as possible, and let's not fall for this commodification of nature. And
Mohammed, you mentioned climate funding. I want to bring in Yuba, and specifically Yuba, I want to show a moment from last year from COP27 in Egypt. We're going to see COP President Sameh Shoukry gavel in on the agreement on the loss and damage fund. Let's take a listen, and I want to talk to you after.
I invite the CMA to adopt the draft decision entitled Funding Arrangements for Responding to Loss and Damage Associated with the Adverse Effects of Climate Change. If there are no objections, it is so decided.
Yuba, I want to talk, as somebody who has been in this industry, focusing on this for as long as you have, this was significant. I was in Egypt last year when this happened. Can you give us your perspective? I mean, when this happened, what was the significance for you?
This is not something new, and we know that. We started in 1997 after the Kyoto Protocol with the Clean Development Mechanism, and we wrote about it. We said that will never work for Africa. It is not the first time that fund has been announced. We know that the 100 billion per year starting from 2020, that will work. And I think that we need to be serious and then to take the problem at the root causes there, where it's needed. It's not a problem of having access to the money. It's to work on three fundamental aspects I indicated. First of all, is on the knowledge, invest on knowledge on people. And then to navigate between that investment with the policy and the practice at the same time. Unless we do that, we'll not go anywhere. It is not because we have resources. We know that. There is a number of countries that do not have any resources. Take Korea, take Japan. They have no natural resources, and they are doing very well. We do have natural resources, but we do not have institutions. We do not have the capacity to articulate clearly our vision, our perspective, to link that. And then to the kind of policy we need to implement. It's not a problem also of having access to funding. And then those are, unless we bring back, we have our fundamentals, and then we know clearly where we want to go, we cannot do anything. We have the Agenda 2063, we never work on it. You go to each of the African countries, you go to different African universities. How we translate that vision into concrete action, we are not doing that. And then those are some of the fundamentals we need to tackle first, rather than looking at hypothetical money that will never be accessible.
Carlos, what's your take on that?
Well, first of all, we know that all these different promises that have been made over the last 2 decades for addressing climate challenges are basically a relabeling of ODA, the Official Development Assistance. Because we have the data produced by the OECD DAC on volumes of aid that are disbursed every year, we know that the amounts have not increased, and therefore we know that what has been happening is basically relabeling. And when we are talking about the needs for the transition in developing countries, and in particular in Africa, normally people talk about de-risking investment and putting some concessional funding or concessional lending available for de-risking. And it's a paradox, because we cannot be de-risking what is actually proclaimed as a planetary urgency, and at the same time, consider that business as usual is what we have right now, which is basically a fossil fuel, carbon-intensive modes of production. So if this is happening, it's basically because the regulatory system, and particularly the economic financial system, is incentivizing the way we produce and the way money circulates. And that's why climate finance is not going to materialize with these proclamations. every COP will come with different funds, with different proposals, including, on carbon credits. All these things basically translate into cop-outs. This is not going to make what is necessary for the transition. We are talking about needs that are in the trillion-dollar range. And the only way this is going to happen is when actually the regulatory system changes. And the transformation of the economic financial system is very much on the agenda, but it's basically incremental reforms that are being proposed, not at the level or commensurate with the needs that we have.
So then what does that mean, Carlos, for COP28? Because, we just saw COP27 last year where this was announced. Now, leaders weren't supposed to, come up with the details of this loss and damage fund. What are you anticipating then come December? I mean, is there still time for something to materialize, in your opinion?
Well, what is interesting with loss and damage fund is the fact that it is a recognition of an historical problem, and therefore puts squarely the discussion where it belongs, which is, sort of admitting that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities matter. This principle, it tends to be forgotten. And therefore, the creation of loss and damage fund is a reaffirmation of that principle, that we are on this together, but we don't have the same responsibilities. Some have produced the damage, some have suffered from it and have not contributed towards the situation that we are living right now. So in that sense, whatever is agreed and approved around loss and damage is progress. But what I'm saying is that progress is not really at the scale that is necessary for transformation to take place in relation to the targets and the ambitious goals that have been defined in Paris. But of course, Paris itself was a way of not, introducing changes in the regulatory system, because it's about voluntary contributions, it's about voluntary determined decisions, and therefore countries themselves don't have any obligation to fulfill what they promise first, and second, they can change them. And that's exactly what has been happening.
And Mohammed, Yuba, I see you want to jump in?
The point is that, as Carlos indicated, the clear message of this loss and damage is the recognition of the attribution of the climate loss and damage. There is a huge difference between those issues and mitigation. Mitigation you can delay, you can postpone, but the impact you have to deal with immediately. But actually, who is paying for the cost of damage is the people, is the African countries. It's not the international community. You cannot delay them because you are affected immediately. You have to react immediately, and then you do the best you can. Actually, implicitly, the African people and government are paying for the loss and damage.
And I want this question, I want our audience to jump in on this question, because this is definitely something our panelists want to weigh in on. Just as I asked Carlos, do you have high hopes for the Loss and Damage Fund? Please let us know on social media with the hashtag Africa's Climate Agenda. Wangiri, did you want to jump in as well?
Yes, absolutely, Jennifer. And thank you so much for allowing me to come in here. I must admit, I was one of the people who celebrated when the Loss and Damage Fund was announced in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. But I quickly realized when I started to see the commitments that were coming into this fund, I think from the EU countries, only $300 million was committed, or euros was committed. And this is, it's disappointing. When you look at the conversation that's happening across the world, we'll need about $4 to $6 trillion of investment each year to get renewable energy off the ground and to everybody. So there's a bigger conversation happening, which is in the trillions, and we're still just being distracted by a conversation in the Loss and Damage Fund of only millions of dollars. So it's important for us to really look at where the real conversation is happening, where the real investment is happening, and where people are really putting big money behind their actions.
Where do you see the biggest obstacles, Wangiri? I mean, we know that Africa has a significantly young population, but not yet has the skills that, a lot of these new industries are really looking for. I mean, is that the biggest obstacle you see, or is there something even bigger you think is getting in the way of any sort of progress?
I think there's three different obstacles that I see here. I think the first one I've already touched on, which is on financing.
Yeah.
And this is not only in regard to how much money is really being committed to Africa. As we know, in the last decade, only 2% of all financing in renewables has gone into Africa. So, and this is despite having 60% of the world's best solar, wind that can power the world 50 times over. This is very, very disappointing. But in addition to that, the cost of debt, so the cost of actual money that we need to bring the projects off the ground is also higher in Africa. So we're paying 30% more than anywhere else in the world. This really needs to be eradicated. The second issue that I think needs to really be looked at closely is, and I think Yuba touched on this before, is the skills. How do we really ensure that the Africans themselves, our engineers of renewable energy technologies, can manufacture these technologies? Right now, we're relying a lot on importing these technologies, and we need more and more African faces and people at the helm of these technologies, innovating around the possibility and this resource that we have in Africa. And in addition to that, we need the ambition to match that. So we need to look at timesing our renewable energy potential and the capacity or install capacity on the continent times 3, times 4, and hopefully even quantum leaping that to ensure that we really take advantage of that.
Mohammed, you want to jump in?
Yes, and I think the way I will actually frame it is in the continent of Africa, it's actually about addressing our development needs in a way that is people-centered. If you discount, half a dozen countries in the north of the continent and South Africa, the rest of Africa is actually underdeveloped. And so we have to address our energy, our limited energy access challenge, which means we have our development ahead of us. And so it's a question of leapfrogging that energy and avoiding emissions. So rather than actually focusing on mitigation per se, what we need to be thinking about is how can we actually help Africa make the right choice about the energy system it's going to actually pursue. So when we think about climate in Africa, we can think of it in silo. It has to be thought in relation to development and in relation to energy. And so what we need to be thinking about is how can we address the intersecting crises of climate, energy, and development, and be able to actually ensure that it's people-centered and it's actually focused on maximizing our people's well-being and prosperity.
Yeah.
I think.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, because there's also the very real, the reality of the cost of living issues and the well-being, as you mentioned there. Carlos, I want to show you some pictures now from a few weeks ago in Nigeria. We know the government recently scrapped fuel subsidies. Take a look at what happened there.
It's been a while since workers in Nigeria have been on the streets to protest. But petrol prices have soared along with other costs after government scrapped fuel subsidies in May. Trade union leaders say earnings no longer keep up with inflation. They want a reversal of government policies.
So, Carlos, if we talk about the well-being of citizens, I mean, you saw there that was a nationwide strike called by unions to protest against the fuel hikes, obviously the cost of living going up. How do you think about this? Because these are people who are, dealing with this on a daily basis. The government is trying with their own green policy. It's clearly hurting the people. I mean, Carlos, how do you sort of square these two, situations?
Well, we can actually make a parallel between what is happening in a country like Nigeria when you scrap fuel subsidies and what happened in France when they introduced a carbon tax that produced the yellow jackets phenomena and all the manifestations against the government. It's basically about making the transition without actually putting in place people-centered solutions. You need those transitions, but you need to do it in a proper way. For instance, fuel subsidies indeed should be scrapped, but they cannot be scrapped in a country where we have 90% of the public revenue coming from oil, and where the entire economy is running around oil. When in fact you have the tax system in Nigeria. With a fiscal pressure of only 6%, which basically means that only 6% of the entire economy size is paying taxes. And this is one of the lowest in the world, basically because the government is not dealing with the entire economy; it's just dealing with oil. So if you just deal with oil, it's obvious that any change is going to affect the entire population, and you need actually to have a structural transformation of the economy. There is no point in Nigeria to keep, importing refined oil products, as Mohammed was saying. And I think, it's just a manifestation of this incapacity in most countries to actually have this coordination of policies that is going to make the transition also appealing and actually allowing the ingredients that are going to create leapfrogging opportunities. But this being said, I'm very hopeful for Nigeria because, things are happening in a context where a lot of changes are occurring. And hopefully some of these changes will see a transformation of the economy. And one certainly major aspect is the Continental Free Trade Area. Because the moment the Continental Free Trade Area will really kick in practical terms, you are going to have a huge African market. Nigeria will be very well positioned with 60% of West Africa GDP to benefit from it and basically get out of this type of dependency that it has on oil.
Yuba, I saw you emphatically nodding. Mohammed, before we get to you, Yuba, can you jump in?
So the point is that we should not take part of the symptoms as a problem. The fundamental problem is energy access in Nigeria, how you make it for development in Nigeria, how you make the development more sustainable, and how you make it climate compatible with the people in Nigeria. Subsidy is only one element of the symptom. This is not solving the problem. And then you remove it, you strengthen it, you are not solving the problem. We need to go back to the fundamental problems.
Mohammed, do you want to jump in?
No, I agree with everything that both Lopez and Yuba said. And I think the trick for Africa is for us to reorient our development towards, inclusivity, social justice, and sustainability. So when we think about just transition, it needs to entail, breaking the cycles of dependency, including fossil fuel dependency, but it needs to start with how we will help address the energy poverty in the country. There are structural imbalances, and those structural imbalances need to be addressed. We don't want, some of the solutions that are proposed to address the climate problem actually aggravating the situation that our people are in. Within a continent with 600 million people without electricity, 1 billion people without clean cooking, and 6 decades after independence, our continent continues to rely, entirely on extractive industries to grow the economy. And this is an example of Nigeria. And then the others are relying on aid and loans to support government and ineffective, economic models to develop. And what has this resulted in? We have fragile economies, we have worsening poverty levels, and even more dependency on the West and their loans. So if you think about, Albert Einstein's, parable of insanity, it may as well be referring to the African, current situation where we perpetually do the same things over and over again and expect different results. I think we need to be asking ourselves, given the vast natural resources of this continent, whether it's, the renewable energy potential, the strategic minerals, our youthful population, how come we're not able to break free from the entrapment and address the structural traps? I think we must take the high road. And that road needs to lead us to actually a sustainable path. And that is how you deliver Africa's people's well-being and prosperity.
Well, and Mohammed, just on that note, we heard a proposal from the former president of Malawi, Joyce Banda. We're going to hear from her in just a few minutes. But in an upcoming fall edition of Project Syndicate's premium subscriber magazine, she says this. She gives this proposal. One promising proposal is to establish a global carbon-based taxation mechanism targeting the corporations that are fueling the climate crisis, with 50% of profits ring-fenced for the loss and damage fund. Mohammed, is that a solution that you think is promising?
I think that is only a solution to help Africa address the hellish future that we must avoid. I think a good chunk of the resources that the continent actually mobilizes through climate reparations or claiming, climate debt must actually go towards helping to support Africa's development, energy access, adaptation, and then thirdly, loss and damage. We're in a very strange where rather than actually thinking through the impacts that we can adapt to, we're now prioritizing the extreme and unbearable impact that will exceed our adaptive capacity. Loss and damage financing is supposed to be an insurance after our adaptation limits are exceeded. And so in Africa, I think there's potential for this continent to become a clean energy superpower. Thankfully, we have abundance of wind, solar, geothermal energy. We need to harness this power, for our development and to help make energy accessible. Why can we say 50% of the claims that will be made out of fossil industry will actually be used to help lead Africa to become the global clean energy superpower? And then secondly, whatever that is left will actually be invested in strengthening our meteorological capacity. We talk about extreme weather events in Africa, but hardly do we have reliable climate forecast that can actually help us inform, the livelihood choices our communities make. So what I'm calling for is let's rethink and think from an African perspective. Let's for a second put aside this Western narrative and frame that continues to privilege what the historic polluters want. If we want to actually effectively address the climate problem in this continent, we need to renew our development vision. We stand on the cusp of transformative development, and we need to rally our continent behind an alternative development agenda that will Africa to be for its people to actually be able to attain well-being and prosperity. And that is through clean energy access, that is through feeding Africa's people, that is actually helping Africa attract the right financing, and some of that locals said around reforming the international financial institutions.
And I want a very quick final question to all of you. I think, Wangari, I'll start with you and Carlos. And I'm going to try to get you guys to say yes or no. But, we're talking about all of the potential of Africa. But do you think it is really within sight that Africa can become a new type of green development? I mean, are we on the cusp of that, Mohammed, as you said? Wangari, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think we are, it's a good and a bad thing that we don't have our energy systems fully developed. I think this gives us a blank slate really to start working from and to really build those green and the clean tech that Mohammed was referring to. In addition to this, I think we're also 20 years ahead of the rest of the nations who have to deconstruct their energy systems at this point. So if we are able to still, just like Norway does, sell our fossil fuels, but use the income from that to really develop our grids, to really develop our renewable energy, that is the key. We need really good vision and leadership to be able to get there.
Great. Carlos.
Well, I would say that you don't have really a solution for the planetary urgency without Africa. Because if you take into account the three megatrends, technology, demography, and environment, you just don't have the solutions. Because in technological terms, you need the youthness that Africa offers. In demographic terms, the population is aging elsewhere. So there is a need actually to count on Africa. And finally, on the environment, we have the largest potential anywhere you look. So unless we harness these three mega trends in the interest of the planet, we are not going to have a solution for the climate crisis. And you can't do it without Africa.
Yuba.
I think there is a clear road how to get there. And then the clear road how to get there is we all collectively have to take a decision right now to phase out the use of charcoal and firewood for cooking by 2040. And then move to electricity is possible, and it encapsulates everything we said now.
Wonderful. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. This has been such an enlightening discussion. I feel like we could all speak for a long time. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for taking part. Wangari Muchiri, Yuba Sakona, Carlos Lopez, and Mohamed Ado. Now, to wrap up today's events, we have Joyce Banda. She is the former president of the Republic of Malawi with her own thoughts on the urgency of a green industrial strategy for Africa. Take a listen.
The discussion in the just ended session goes to emphasize the urgency needed to save ourselves and generations to come from the calamity of climate change. The state of the globe is such that we must act quickly and act now. Collectively, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, to achieve, and for Africa, additionally, we have the 2063 agenda to achieve if we are to positively impact people's lives. Successful implementation of these goals requires our unceasing focus on a delicate balance of ensuring economic growth alongside sustainable environmental management. The global response to the threat of climate change continues to be timid, throwing into doubt our ability to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. We continue to drag our feet on meeting our climate financing commitment and investment, missing out on the opportunity to decisively slow down global warming. The increased occurrence of climate change-related disasters has put most African governments in a financial squeeze and debt distress. Tropical Cyclone Freddy that hit Malawi this March affected about 2.5 million people, 676 deaths recorded, and it caused catastrophic infrastructure damage. The total cost of recovery and reconstruction is estimated at $764 million. Malawi, like other developing countries, has no capacity to shoulder this reconstruction cost. These unfortunate incidents, however, avail an opportunity for governments and the private sector to forge strong partnerships, to build back better and in an environmental friendly manner. A case in point is a community development initiative that I championed here in Malawi that has managed to integrate rural community food security, economic empowerment, and environmental management, leveraging on climate financing. Working with our American partners, the initiative has placed the project area on a path to a resilient community. We believe our partnership with government and the community itself as key player is critical to assuring its resilience to calamities. As we prepare for COP28, we have a responsibility to immune ourselves and generations to come from climate change and achieve sustainable economic growth and development.
And thanks so much to Joyce Banda for that message. Now, before I say my final goodbye, I want to tell you about the next Project Syndicate event, which will be on climate and development finance. It will be held in person and remotely, if you can't be there, on the 18th of September at 4 p.m. CEST. It will come live from New York. We expect lots of action as the UN General Assembly and New York Climate Week will be going on at the same time, so definitely one to watch out for, and we really hope that you can join us for that. But for today, that's all that we have. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks again to a really wonderful panelists for all of your time. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja, and this was Africa's Climate Agenda, brought to you by Project Syndicate.